Good Sunday evening, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to another Southern Oregon Weather Weekend Update. We'll talk about how our forecast verified over the first 2 weeks of June. Then we'll discuss the 7 days ahead. We'll talk about what our teleconnections are showing for the end of the month. And then we'll discuss the latest trends for June. So over the last few weeks, the end of May heading into the beginning of June, we talked a lot about this cooler and wetter period of weather that we were going to see over the first couple weeks of this month, and that forecast verified quite well. Here's the mean temperature anomaly, so the average temperature over the month compared to what it usually is, and you can see we saw largely cooler than normal temperatures over the first 2 weeks of the month. When we look at precipitation, we also see that the Rogue Valley received between 2 and 300% of normal precipitation during that time. Now that was largely because of a few pretty substantial precipitation events. Some of these were convective events, so thunderstorms dropping a lot of rain in a very short period of time. The latest episode happened just a couple days ago at the end of last week. But still, our forecast for a cooler and wetter start to June verified quite well. So what can we expect going forward? Well, here is the radar return from the KMAX on top of Mount Ashland as of 5 p.m., so a little while ago. You can see we're starting to get some returns, and this is hinting at our next chance for showers heading into the beginning of the work week. So here's our current 500 millibar analysis for as of this morning. You can see here is the trough that caused so much havoc at the end of last week, kind of moving away, departing our area and heading into the Rockies. But you can see that there's another trough lined up right behind it, and that's going to push in over the next day or two on west to northwest flow. Before we talk about our next chance for showers, I want you to appreciate the similarity between this setup with a kind of a high amplitude ridge over the northern plains, trough in the east, trough in the west, and MJO phase 3. We are in phase 3 currently, and forecast to move through phase 2 over the next couple days. Once again, the MJO is areas of thunderstorms moving across the Indian Ocean and into the Pacific, has a big influence on our weather when it is outside of this circle called the null phase here in general. Sometimes the MJO can be overruled by other factors, but in this case, you can see the similarity between MJO phase 3 during the month of June and our current 500 millibar pattern. See the ridge over the northern plains, trough in the east, trough in the west. Doesn't line up perfectly, but I think it's a pretty good fit. So if we move this 500 millibar forecast forward a couple days, here's what it looks like by Monday afternoon. And you can see that second trough has moved into our area, and that's going to produce another round of showers. Here's a loop of the GFS, the American model, showing these showers arriving Monday morning and then lingering on into Tuesday morning, maybe even Tuesday afternoon, and then everything clears out by Wednesday. So let's talk about precipitation amounts. Here's the WPC's precipitation forecast, the Weather Prediction Center, for the next couple of days. You can see, as is typical with a lot of these weaker west to northwest flow events, most of the rain is going to occur along and north of the Umpqua Divide, and then from about Mount McLaughlin northward. That's pretty typical with these weaker northwest flow events. But we could still see some rain in the valley, just not expecting very much. In fact, we could even see some snow over the higher terrain. National Weather Service is forecasting a couple inches to fall at Crater Lake. So if we roll the forecast forward to the end of the week, we see that the GEFS, the American Ensemble, wants to build a ridge over the area by the weekend. And I think there's good support for this. I want to show you a chart of the Southern Oscillation Index over the last month. So the SOI is basically a measure of the pressure patterns across the equatorial Pacific. It measures the difference in pressure between Tahiti, obviously an island, and then Darwin in Australia. So these pressure patterns are associated with either stronger or weaker easterly winds, and they're associated with either a La Nina or El Nino-like state in the atmosphere. A negative SOI is kind of a strong El Nino signal. And just like the MJO moving through the Indian Ocean has an impact on our weather, the SOI has an impact on our weather as well. The impact, though, has a lag to it. So here we saw a huge drop in the SOI, really a massive drop about 2 weeks ago, about 10 days ago actually. That drop is going to have an influence on our weather for this weekend. So it's going to take effect this weekend. There's about a 2-week lag for the western U.S., give or take a couple days, between what the SOI does and then what our weather is doing along the west coast. So here's the SOI drop on June 5th. Here's the correlation between a negative SOI and the 500 millibar pattern that we would expect to see as a result of that in June. And you can see a negative SOI puts a strong ridge over our area. And once again, there is that lag. So the SOI plunged about 10 days ago, and so in about 4 more days we can expect that we could see some ridging develop here. And that is exactly what the models are showing us. So interesting to see that connection. So here's all that information summarized for you very nicely by the Weather Channel. Here's our chance for showers on Monday, lingering into Tuesday morning, and then things start to clear out by Wednesday and warm up as that ridge builds in over our area, thanks to that Southern Oscillation Index drop that we saw about 10 days ago. So if we look at the forecast on day 10 from all 3 of the major ensembles, the European on the bottom, American ensemble, the GEFS on the upper left, and Canadian ensemble on the upper right, they all want to keep this ridge over our area into and possibly beyond day 10. And I think there's good support for that. Not only did we see that very huge SOI drop to kick things off here toward the end of this week, but we're also seeing this PNA signal spike. And we've talked about how in June, the positive PNA is actually kind of a cooler signal. And June is kind of an oddball month in that regard. Usually a positive PNA puts a ridge over our area. And so as we move toward the end of June into July, we get that familiar signal once again, where a strongly positive PNA is a signal for ridging over our area. So I think the idea that the models are catching on to, that the ridging is going to hang on into day 10 and maybe beyond, I think that's an accurate idea. So we have the PNA going positive, and that's going to keep the ridge going over the Pacific Northwest. So if we look at the very end of the forecast range on the GEFS and the Canadian ensembles, they want to start to lower heights along the west coast again. I think that's possible. We talked about a positive PNA being correlated with ridging as we go into the end of the month and into July. Well, here we see that the PNA is forecast to fall off again toward the end of the month. So it's definitely possible that we could see maybe a week to maybe 10 days of warmth, and then for the very last few days of the month, we could see temperatures moderate. So this is going to be our first real taste of summer heat. I know we had a few brief days at the end of May and even earlier this month, but this is going to be our kind of first longer, warmer period. However, I don't think it's just going to keep running on for weeks and weeks, because we do see this PNA start to drop again by the end of the month. Also, there's some other signals like the MJO continuing to hang around in phases 1, 2, and 3. Those are generally cooler phases. The atmospheric angular momentum is forecast to stay negative or neutral through the end of the month. That's also a cooler phase. And as we discussed last week, this positive angular momentum trend has been getting less and less pronounced. So there's a chance that it could stay neutral even into the beginning of July. So speaking of July, let's talk about the latest signals. So here's what July would tend to look like in a positive angular momentum scenario. You can see that's a signal for ridging, but as I just mentioned, that positive AAM trend is starting to flatten out, and I think it could end up being more neutral, at least for the beginning of the month. And that would mean that the angular momentum just really isn't that big of a player. We do have some other signals like the equatorial sea surface temperatures, the Nino 1.2 index that measures the water temperatures off the coast of South America, kind of farther over toward the coast of Peru and Ecuador. And you can see that's been falling off very rapidly over the course of the spring and heading into the start of the summer. And the correlation with cooler than normal Nino 1.2 temperatures is shown here. There's a signal for some form of troughing over the Pacific Northwest and some form of ridging over the central part of the U.S. So that's definitely counter to a positive angular momentum signal. So this shows me that July probably isn't going to be super hot, at least not the beginning of the month. Also, the MJO has been kind of locked into a standing wave pattern, kind of circling back through phases 1, 2, and 3 over a good part of the past month, the past 2 weeks. And if that continues, that's also kind of a coolish signal. This looks awfully close to the pressure pattern for negative ENSO 1.2, well 1 plus 2. And I think this is the kind of pattern that we could see heading into July. Ridging over the central part of the U.S., some form of a trough trying to impact the Pacific Northwest. Maybe a little bit of a battle zone between ridging to the south, troughing to the north. But I'm not seeing any signals for a much hotter than normal July. So let's summarize all that information. We do have showers returning on Monday and hanging on into Tuesday. Once again, this is going to be different from our super thunderstorm event that we saw at the end of last week, because we're going to be under west and northwest flow, not southerly flow. And the showery pattern is consistent with MJO Phase 2. However, we have other influencers, other pattern drivers taking hold by the end of the week. PNA is going to turn strongly positive, and that SOI drop that we saw 10 days ago, that's going to take effect. Looks like that warmth will probably hang on until the end of June, so it's going to be our first period of kind of extended warmth. But it may moderate toward the very end of the month as that PNA falls again. And then for July, we do see that positive angular momentum trend hasn't been super reliable on the CFSV2 over the last couple of weeks. And we do see that that trend is countered by other factors, like the ENSO region's cooling and these cooler MJO phases 1 through 3. So I'm not seeing a super strong signal for July heat at this time. Guys, thanks so much for tuning in. Don't forget to set your notifications for that next weekend update. And please leave a like and a comment if you enjoyed the forecast.